Good day, and welcome to Voices of Contemporary Islamic Thought. My name is Aqil Dhanani, and in our fourth joint session in the series, we will discuss the role of education in understanding the multifaceted context of Islam as a faith, an ethic, a way of life, and a humanistic endeavor. These sessions are sponsored by the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London and the University of Melbourne in Victoria. The Institute of Ismaili Studies is dedicated to the study of Islam, embracing its humanistic values, both historically and in contemporary times, with a particular focus on Shia Islam and its Ismaili persuasion. The National Center for Contemporary Islamic Studies, part of the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne, hosts a multidisciplinary approach to Islamic studies, and we're delighted to continue this conversation with Professor Abdullah Saeed from the University of Melbourne. Professor Saeed currently holds the Oman Chair of Arab and Islamic Studies and is also the director of the National Center of Contemporary Islamic Studies at the University of Melbourne. His extensive scholarly contributions include sole-authored books, edited books, and journal articles across a range of important topics dealing with understanding and interpreting the Quran, international human rights law, human rights and Islam, Islamic political thought and governance, and Islamic banking. Professor Saeed has also co-edited a book on Muslim communities in Australia. Professor Saeed was appointed a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2010. He was awarded the Medal of Australia by the Government of Australia for service worthy of particular recognition in 2013. Thank you, Professor Saeed.
Thank you, Aqil. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers to you today. Professor Malise Ruthven, Professor Azim Nanji, Dr Salim Kassim-Lakha, and our moderator, Dr Mohamed Keshavjee. Let me start off with Professor Malise Ruthven. Professor Ruthven holds an MA in English Literature and a PhD in Social and Political Sciences from Cambridge University. He has taught Islamic studies, cultural history, and comparative religion in the United Kingdom and the United States. He is the author of a number of books. For example, Islam in the World, which is a critically acclaimed overview of Islamic faith and history. His other books include The Divine Supermarket, Shopping for God in America, which was nominated for the 1989 Thomas Cook Travel Award. He also published Islam, A Very Short Introduction. He is a highly respected reviewer of books on Islam and writes for a number of highly acclaimed journals in the English language. Professor Azim Nanji currently serves as a board member of the Aga Khan University, UK, and of the Global Centre for Pluralism in Ottawa, Canada. Previously, he served as the director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London and as the Senior Associate Director of the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies at Stanford University. He obtained his MA and PhD in Islamic Studies from McGill University and has authored and edited a number of books on Islam in historical and contemporary contexts. Professor Nanji has served as a co-chair at the American Academy of Religion and was on the editorial board of the Academy's journal. He has served at different times as a member of the master jury of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, as well as on its steering committee. Dr Salim Kassim-Lakha is an honorary senior fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He is a specialist in development studies with a particular focus on South Asia. His scholarly publications cover topics such as economic liberalization and the middle class in India, governance and social protection, civil society, and transnational migration. He has since retired from formal teaching at the University of Melbourne. but continues to contribute to scholarly activities associated with the university, such as this ongoing lecture series. Finally, Dr. Mohamed Keshavjee is a South African-born English-trained barrister who is an international specialist on cross-cultural mediation. He is presently a scholar in contemporary Muslim jurisprudence. He has published 4 books, including Understanding Sharia, Islamic Law in a Globalized World, which received critical acclaim in a number of journals. He lives in the UK while teaching a summer course on law and society at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. I will now invite Dr. Keshavjee to moderate our session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Saeed. Good day to you, wherever in the world you are. If I may humbly request that for the purposes of our conversation today, that we refer to each other by our first names, because that is no disrespect meant, but it will be easier for us to be able to conduct our conversation with a degree of ease. I will put my first question to Professor Azim Nanji. Azim, since our discourse today is focused on education, can you please give us a brief idea of your involvement with the Madrasa program in East Africa, which the Aga Khan Foundation Geneva pioneered in the 1980s? Please tell us how this initiative arose, what it entailed, what were some of the challenges it faced, and what was the outcome the program achieved. Here, Azim, I would like you to tell us how the program, which dealt with the religious formation of different Muslim traditions, was able to develop a curriculum that was acceptable to all. Could you give us a little background of your engagement and your perception on what it achieved?
So, as I think we all know, there is a significant Muslim presence on the East African coast. And this has been there since really the 8th century. And we have monuments that show part of that history that illustrate how Muslim culture embedded itself within the East African coast and took on very significant characteristics that still continue to our day. If we jump ahead to the 1980s, we're looking at a moment of crisis. This is approximately 20 years after Kenya became independent. There were many efforts to develop educational policy, educational institutions, but there was a clear sort of sense that the Muslim population on the coast was marginalized, that it did not benefit from accessibility to new education, and that it created for the Muslim community not only an educational deficit, but also subsequently an economic deficit. So I think we're looking at a moment of crisis when the Muslim community came together in a meeting with His Highness the Aga Khan in 1982 and discussed this situation. And it was recommended that a study be undertaken and that study would make recommendations on what possible options there were for that Muslim community. And one of the strands that emerged from this analysis was that the problem lay at the beginning. It lay in early childhood. And if you did not resolve the issue of preparing young men, young women to go into the larger school system, then there would always continue to be this deficit. So I think it's important to recognize that by this time, the importance of early childhood education was becoming wider. It was known that the formation of a child really takes place in those early years, and that if you neglect them, you will have a very negative impact on the children's cognitive development, but also on its future engagement with society. So one of the decisions that was made, and in retrospect, it seems such a wise decision, was to use what I would call spaces of trust in which to start this program. And these spaces of trust were the Quran schools, madrasas, so that children and parents would feel a sense of comfort that they were in an environment where the children's faith, sense of identity, and cultural belonging would be protected. Now, the reasons for this are many. Over time, the educational system in East Africa during colonialism was dominated by Christian missionaries. They did a tremendous amount of good work, but there was always a suspicion within the Muslim community that if they went to these Christian mission schools, that there was a chance that their children would be converted to Christianity. So there was this fear that prevented participation in the larger educational system. As a result, young children, when they were getting ready to go to the primary school, were finding that they did not have access because they simply didn't have the tools even to be admitted into primary school since it was very competitive. So the madrasas became a space where they would have an opportunity to continue their education in their religious formation, but additional subjects would be introduced. And the truly, I call it partly miraculous moment, was that they found a leader, a champion, a woman called Bi Safia, who in retrospect is called Nyanya in Kiswahili, which means grandmother. And she really was the grandmother of this program. A trained teacher, she had wide experience, but then she volunteered to take over this program, went around to communities, enabling them to free up their madrasa space for this new program. Initially, in 1986, there were just 4 schools. And I want to jump to today when there are 200 schools across East Africa, starting from the Indian Ocean and going all the way to the Nile in Uganda. So you've had a remarkable growth. They have trained some 8,000 teachers, and those 8,000 teachers have had an impact on over 1 million children. This is a well-established program, internationally funded and recognized, and now has transformed the lives of many children, not only on the East African coast where it started, but all the way down to Zanzibar and across into the West Nile region, where it is beginning to establish itself. The other point I want to make is this wasn't simply a school-based program, a madrasa-based program. It was also became a center for teacher training. And the teacher training brought a large number of women into the program, women who would otherwise would not have had economic opportunity or a profession. And this training enabled these women to become mentors to these children, and over time become experts in early childhood education. So much so that in places like Zanzibar, the government has partially taken over these teacher training centers established early on and made them into state institutions. So there is impact at the regional level. There's, of course, impact on the lives of children and women, but there is also policy impact on government efforts to create a larger system of early childhood education in East Africa.
Azim, thank you very much. In fact, it is fascinating that you were part of that process from the early days, and also in an area where you were brought up. I think you spent some time in Mombasa yourself as a young student, and I think possibly also taught there for a little while. But fascinating how sound education becomes a process for meaningful transformation. Let us now turn to Malise. Malise, if I can now turn to you, you entered the field of Islamics largely through your work in the media. You were with the BBC at the time and traveled quite a bit in the Middle East. How did the media affect the non-Muslim Western perception of Islam? What was your learning curve? Here, Malise, you may want to elaborate on some of the books you read. I remember when I met you about 40 years ago, I myself was on the learning curve. And I still recall, Malise, that you mentioned some of the books that you found fascinating. I recall your mentioning The Venture of Islam by Marshall Hodgson. You spoke about The History of the Arab Peoples by Albert Hourani, who you knew very closely. You spoke about The Message of the Quran by Muhammad Asad. And then you yourself, a new person like Michael Gilson, who was a leading anthropologist. But I think it was a steep learning curve. And here, maybe, Malise, can you highlight how your quest for getting a deeper understanding of Islam and its multifaceted dimensions was inspired by the education that you touched on at that time?
I actually spent my gap year as a young student before I went to university in southern Jordan, working with Oxfam and Save the Children Fund. So I sort of got to know the Arab world in a very particular way amongst the Huaytat tribe in southern Jordan, and had great respect for the calm way they managed to live in a very difficult environment. Then after I'd graduated, I did a course in Arabic in Lebanon. And then after that, in fact, it was known as the Spy School because it's where the Foreign Office trained people to go and govern bits of the Muslim world, especially in the Gulf. But I decided that as someone born in Ireland, I didn't really like to be part of the old imperial system, and joined the BBC Arabic service, where I worked as a talks writer and script writer and editor for a number of years. And I think really the moment which was really critical came in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, when I had already actually left the BBC at that time, and I was working for a number of magazines, which were funded by Arabs but written in English. And it was at the time when the general knowledge of Islam was, I think one could say, very weak in Western countries. There was a famous story after the Iranian Revolution broke up in 79, when people said the lights of the State Department building in Washington were on all night, where people were speed reading the Quran, because it came as a big shock to them that this was a religious revolution, not a secular nationalist one, when it was still during the Cold War, when they assumed that the enemy was going to come from Moscow and not from Tehran. And as a consequence of that, I started trying to get my head around what you might call the Islamic discourse. And as Mohammed mentioned, a very important source was Marshall Hodgson's magnum opus, the 3-volume Venture of Islam. He was an extraordinary man. He was a Quaker, died very young at the age of 46 in Chicago, but he produced this massive work which really was based on the person who really became, you could say, my ultimate mentor, the work of Ibn Khaldun, because Ibn Khaldun is often seen as the founding father of sociology, not just in the Muslim world, but in the West as well, because he saw the arid zone, the dynamics of the physical world as instrumental in developing the discourses which produce political Islam. And it was really on the basis of that that I became interested in the whole subject, and I produced a book a while back. It was published in 1984, Islam and the World, which was, you could say, a kind of Khaldunian take on the contemporary Islamic world, because I still feel that if you want to understand what's happening, certainly in the Middle East, politically and sociologically, you need to look no further than the Muqaddimah, the great work of Ibn Khaldun. I also was familiar with the writings and the personality of Mike Gilson, who then, he was in London for a while. I used to see him quite often, but then he moved to New York. So it's a different kind of learning curve, because it wasn't really an academic one. Having been trained as a journalist with BBC, I would say my initiation into the discourse of Islam was through trying to understand the background of particular political events, because these are the things the BBC had been hiring me to write about. The other very important encounter, which Mohammed also mentioned, was with Mohammed Assad. He had grown up in an Orthodox rabbinical family in Lviv, what's now in Ukraine, Lemberg in those days under the Habsburgs, and had become, like me, a journalist. He was sent off by the Frankfurter Allgemeine to cover the campaigns of Ibn Saud, the founder of the Saudi kingdom, in the late 1920s, fell in love with the Arabs and Islam and converted to Islam. But being from a very strong rabbinical scholarly background, he then devoted the rest of his life to a major commentary and translation of the Quran itself, some of the works of Hadith he's done, and also he became a political analyst. And he became quite a friend of mine. He liked my book very much, and was kind enough to say he thought it the best introduction to Islam written by a non-Muslim at that time. And as a consequence, we used to sort of have meetings and talk together. And I think you could say he was something of an inspiration for my work as well. Interestingly now, some years ago after his death, they made a TV program about him, George Mish made, and I went off to Morocco to sort of revisit some of the places he had been to. And there's now a new biography about him, or it's a biographical essay with other figures, written by my former colleague at Dartmouth College, Shalom Goldman, who, though Jewish and a practicing Jew, he actually has huge respect for Mohammed Weiss and Mohammed Assad, as he became known.
If I may now go back to Azim Nanji. Azim, back to you. Can you tell us about how a better understanding of the built environment of the Muslim world was engendered through the Aga Khan Award for Architecture? Professor Saeed mentioned your connection with this process at two levels. One at the level of the steering committee, where you were a member for some time, and the other was at the level of the master jury. Now, basically, Azim, you're a historian, and here you were a member of the steering committee and the master jury of one of the largest architectural prizes in the world. Perhaps you can give us an idea what the award was all about, and what was it meant to achieve? And why do you think that some background on the built environment is of importance for people to gain a better understanding of Islam? Can you also highlight how this award rewards creativity, and more particularly, the integration of living communities in the architectural design concepts in the Muslim world? It's a long question, Azim, I know, but if you can break it up for our viewership into small bites like you do so well, I think it'll give us an idea of this dimension of the Islamic humanities.
So let me start with a confession. I have very little knowledge of architecture before I got involved in the award. So I went into the process as somebody who represented a perspective of a cultural and intellectual historian. But it was one of the most important learning experiences of my life to find how broad and encompassing this award became over time. Again, it started in 1977 with a conversation which you'll be familiar with, Eglamo. It was a group of people who were architects, scholars, practitioners, community leaders who gathered and under the chairmanship of His Highness discussed the place of architecture at that time in the Muslim world. And, you know, perhaps analogous to the situation of the Madrasa, where you had an absence of education for Muslims within the larger context of education and little understanding of the long history of commitment to learning in Muslim societies. So with architecture, while you have a tremendous history of architectural achievement, what was happening in the contemporary Muslim world sometimes bore very little relationship to that past. You know, we forget that buildings of all sorts are probably among the most critical factors in our lives. We live in homes, we study in schools, we work in buildings, we are surrounded by infrastructure. So building is a very important and integral component of human life and society. And I think what had happened during that period is that as countries became independent and Muslim countries set about on the task of development, they realized that they would need to build a lot of spaces. But they went quickly to models that already existed in Europe and in the United States. Most of the architects who designed this were trained in the West. So what you were getting were buildings that were based primarily on models coming out of the Western world. And there was very little regard not only for the history of architecture in the Muslim world, but for an understanding of the built environment as a whole. And I think it would be best to illustrate with a few examples the range that the Architecture Award has developed. So one of the examples is a typical place that Muslims would have, and they've probably built more mosques in the last 25 years than in the last 1500. There is a mosque in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, called Baitul Rauf. And it sort of turns the idea of the traditional mosque on its head. It doesn't have a traditional minaret, it doesn't have a dome. But it uses notions of light to create an environment of kind of almost a supreme sense of calmness, tranquility. And in that space, which is in a marginalized part of Dhaka, you have the local community participate. And that community is, again, a low-income community. And it has this community space in which to express its faith without having to think of models of mosques that, of course, have gone up all over the world in more richer Muslim societies, more grandiose constructions and so on. So that is looking at a religious building. The second one I want to pick out is a Tabiat bridge in Tehran. It's an overpass between two parks. It connects two parks, and it's a fairly long bridge. But I think, as Wole Soyinka, the African novelist, said, bridges don't just go from here to there. They also come back from there to here. And I think what I like about the notion of that bridge is it's a form of exchange. It exchanges one spot on one side, creates an exchange with the other side. And on the bridge, there are restaurants, places of rest, a community space where people can interact. And it's a large recreational space in the middle of Tehran, which illustrates, I think, how you can use infrastructure in a way that connects communities. By the way, both of the architects for the program are women. Marina Tabassum in Bangladesh and Laila in Iran. Another project that I think I developed a lot of fondness for came during the first time I was on the jury. And it's one that Abdullah might be familiar with. It's in the middle of Jakarta. It's a kampong built on what used to be a garbage dump, where homeless people lived. And it was a project created by university faculty, some local architects, students, and the community leaders, who all made an effort to create, out of whatever materials they could find, a place where the homeless would have homes. And it was a lovely little project. And I remember we had members on the jury, architects of international renown, whose initial response was, we're looking to award signature buildings, buildings that speak to humanity, that form the highest notions of what architecture can give us possibilities for. And here was this small kampong housing project, and everybody voted for it. And I could see the transformation in the minds of the architects from being wanting to recognize signature buildings of signature architects to looking at a project that had social relevance, that was community-based, and that was conceived within the community in very simple terms. And I think its simplicity simply just won over everyone. Now, these are illustrations of the range that the award has developed. So it's not only buildings, it's community spaces, it's infrastructure, and increasingly now it's a reference to landscape and environmental projects that allow you to see solutions to the kind of impact that climate change is having. And I'll finish off with one example again in Bangladesh, which is a kind of school and a center for children. I think those of us who have been to Bangladesh know that there are many parts of Bangladesh that flood 5 months a year. And there are areas where, structures get swept away. So schools tended to be on pretty delicate grounds. You had to close them down for 5 months and probably rebuild them afterwards. And this architect created an amphibious school that actually floats on water. And the imagination that he used out of local materials, local design, created a school that would allow children to be there for 12 months a year. And it never got overrun by floods because it would float when the floods came. and it would remain intact. So these are some of the ways in which I think the architecture program as a whole has embraced the full span, not just of buildings, but of the built environment, and particularly, I think, the dangers we face because of climate change. So it's an evolving project. One of the things I love about it is that there is no dogma in it. And I think it's this approach to looking at issues from a cultural lens, a contemporary lens, but also a very pragmatic lens that has made it, I think, an international award of renown.
Thank you, Azim. I do recall being at one of the seminars in Jakarta, maybe about 30 years ago, and I recall that you spoke at that seminar. Of course, Malise, you and I have also been to one or two seminars. If I'm not mistaken, we were in Cairo together many years ago. So this award has brought in its vortex a range of professionals from all different fields, but not only educated professionals, it's been masons, it's been people, it's been architects who built institutions. I think in one case, there was a poet who built a particular building, and in a country where there were many architects, the only person to win the award from that country was a poet. So it just shows the creativity of this absolutely superb award that is still an ongoing process in the learning field. Malise, I'm going to get back to you now. Malise, you gave us a lovely idea of your learning curve, and I could say that your learning curve was also a learning curve of many people, including myself. Over the last 30, 40 years, you've also been writing on books that have come out from the Western world and elsewhere. You write for the New York Review of Books, you write for the Time Literary Supplement on those books that have come out. What do you think more can be done in the field of education to broaden this horizon of understanding, number one? And number two, do you see any difficulty in the present global context of electronics? We're seeing fake news, artificial intelligence, deep fake videos. How do you reconcile that with the need for a deeper reflective engagement with education and books? What do you see the challenges? What do you see the way forward for more people to get the type of learning that you were so fortunate to develop through your interest? Can you throw some light on that?
The issue of how secondary education can be improved vis-a-vis Islam is one which I really have no personal knowledge of, although because I've only ever taught at the tertiary level in universities. But I did work with the publisher as a consultant, the late Irad Baghazadi, IB Taurus, and I think his idea was a very creative one, which was that you needed to have an imprimatur, a publisher who would produce a much broader range of discourses, books about the Islamic world. It's not just about the Islamic world. And I think that process, that huge reservoir, if you think of the number of books that have been published in the last 40 years on the Middle East, on Islam, on related subjects, does in the end filter down to the secondary level, so that teachers have to be aware that this is the conversation that is going on at the present time. And although, of course, you have a lot of negative stories about Islam that come out of jihadist movements and atrocities that have occasionally happened at different parts, you also have a discourse which is much more available now than it was in the past, that this is related to broader factors, whether they're social, whether they're political. And the conversation, as it were, continues. I myself wrote a book about 9/11 2 years after that atrocity happened, and it was trying to maintain a balanced account and saying, look, it's not just all one-sided. If you're looking at what's happening in the Middle East today, you can see the horrors that's taking place in Gaza, but one has to look back to see what was happening in Iraq a few years ago, after the Americans decided that they would take revenge on Saddam Hussein, who had nothing to do with 9/11, on the Iraqi people. So there are these issues, these currents that are happening. Some are very negative. And I think part of the problem with news, and I have been a news reporter or news editor in my day in the BBC, part of the problem is that news is bad news almost by definition. Nobody really registers in the public media the good, quiet, decent people, say in the UK, the people who run corner shops, who are just carrying on decent lives, they're paying their taxes, they're bringing up their children, they're Muslims, and that they don't sort of attach a big label to themselves. They're not the people who are necessarily noted. But funnily enough, 2 days ago at a conference in Sweden, I was asked a little bit about this. I said, well, what is it about the virtues of Islam that you would note as being consequential? And I paused for a bit, and then I said, well, if I really think about it, so many people in corner shops in London, the people I know, people I interact with, and you find the same here in France, these are people who still believe in ultimate judgment, the judgment of the afterlife. And what determines their good behavior is not so much the sanction of their peers, but the thought that ultimately they will be answerable for what they do. I don't happen to share those beliefs, but I have huge respect for them. With regard to the future, which is what Mohammed, the second question, you were asking, where are we going from now? I think it's very important to just see, or to try to take an overview, or this is something I've tried to do, of the impact of the new technologies which are sweeping across the world. And I think in some respects, the Islamic world is very well placed to take advantage of this. In my historical understanding of the Muslim world, there was always a problematic which really came out of the colonial period, when the Western powers took over most of the Muslim countries in the world and imposed rigid state structures with organized frontiers, sanctioned in international law. And the whole idea of the national state was one that actually runs contrary to the traditional milieu of the Islamic world in sort of pre-modern time, when you could have someone like Ibn Battuta traveling from Tunisia all the way to China and back, no passports, no security checks, and just in this wonderful sort of way in which someone who was scholarly, who spoke Arabic, could suddenly find themselves being appointed a judge in Maldives. That is a world which obviously has disappeared. And we now live in a world of rather rigid compartmentalization, where you have border controls and frontiers, and you have to produce your passport if you want to cross from one to the other. Something I'm very much aware of when I go through the Gare du Nord, because I'm an Irish citizen, and the poor Brits who voted for Brexit have to queue for hours to get through the barriers. But when you come to the world of cyberspace, we're in a very different situation, because the exchange of ideas is not restricted either by language or by physical limitation. You can't, there's no point in burning books anymore, because books are all virtual. The knowledge that is universally available is all there on the web. And even if some missile comes and hits the computers that control the cloud, we know that the knowledge, the information is there. And I think this is going to have huge consequences, some positive, some negative. I don't think one can ever be too sure which way it goes. But for instance, traditional structures of authority, imams giving sermons in mosques, scholars formed by classical modes of study issuing fatwas, are now being outflanked by online scholars such as the late Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who may have thousands of online followers. My thought is that this may have, as I say, positive as well as negative implications for the future of Islam. On the positive side, the emergence of the national state since the colonial period had negative effects on the free development of Islamic thought and society, because basically you had the narrative, the discourse of Islam, more or less controlled by national governments. And if a mufti or a scholar stood out of line, as you still find in some places, he found himself in jail. Once national states were enshrined through structures of international legitimacy conferred by the UN membership, there was a tendency for national governments to appropriate the Islamic discourse and to use it for its own purposes. I think the positive effect of the cyberation, if you can call it that, of the cyber Islamic environments, as they're sometimes called, CIEs, is that actually it's overcoming those restrictions. And you're having conversations online between Muslims of different persuasions. And of course, sometimes, like all conversations, and particularly where people have the refuge, if you like, of anonymity, you will find sort of unpleasant, rather vitriolic encounters. But on the plus side, in fact, it does enable people to talk to each other across huge geographical boundaries. And I think there is a search, if Islam, as I've always understood it, is about not so much the order to maintain certain behaviors, but actually about looking for truth, searching for God through the universe, through the search for the ultimate. In that respect, the internet is producing huge or opening up huge possibilities. One only has to take an example of, say, those fantastic images we sometimes see, which have recently been produced of distant galaxies through the James Webb Telescope, to see that the cosmos is much bigger, much grander than anyone could have imagined a few centuries ago. And the Muslim world is going through the most fantastic transformation, because it's only a couple of decades ago that you had some scholars issuing fatwas for people who thought who argued that the world went round the sun rather than the other way around. And it's a very dynamic moment in terms of thought. But what I think becomes much more salient now is the possibility that great minds of pre-modern Islamic times, people like Ibn Khaldun and Ibn Rushd and Abu Sina, people who had an extraordinary vision of the divine, which kind of extended beyond the material right into the universal cosmic, if you like to put it that way. That kind of understanding and that kind of intelligence is becoming much more salient for young people today because of the possibilities of the internet. So it's not all bad news. A lot of it, I think, is very, very good news. And I think because Muslims now more and more in the world form a transnational community, it's something where not only they will benefit, but I think in the future, this is the direction of travel. And I find that something inspiring and something which gives one hopeful thoughts at a time, current time, of danger and insecurity.
Thank you, Malise, for such a capacious perspective. You've told us about the potential of, electronic development. I just think about Carl Sagan when he got the spacecraft to take a picture of the world. He called it the pale blue dot, and from 600 billion kilometers or 6 billion kilometers, the Earth is a little speck in this large shaft of light. And when you think about that and the age of the universe being something like 14.5 billion years old, then obviously it makes us reflect much deeper than what our minds can fathom about the meaning of being human. So thank you for that very illuminating perspective that you've given purely from your own journey. Azim, I'm going to get back to you now. And Azim, for some years now, you have been involved with the work of the Global Center for Pluralism in Ottawa. The center was set up by the Canadian government and the Ismaili Imamate, and is dedicated to the study of how a pluralistic vision can lead to a better understanding between cultures. Can you give us an idea of its work and provide some examples where the Global Center of Pluralism Studies have contributed to a better understanding of both historical grievances, but also how pluralism can become a mode of discourse and promote a culture of dialogue? I believe, Azim, you're still on that board at this moment, and perhaps you can throw some light on that endeavor in the discourse where education is being looked at as a portal for a better understanding from within Islam itself, but also between Islam and other cultures.
So let me start by saying that in the midst of the vast galaxy and galaxies that this pale blue dot exists, I hope nobody's looking at it at the moment, because it certainly would not give them the impression that pluralism is thriving. I think one of the difficulties, and I'm so glad that Malise struck a hopeful note about where we might be going, but one of the dangers of any form of reflection is a kind of present-mindedness. And I think the Global Center for Pluralism, in my mind, exists so that we may avoid this present-mindedness, because you can look at the world as it is today and see so much conflict, devastation, horror being imposed by human beings on each other, that you lose confidence in the idea that pluralism is something not only of value, but is being manifested in the lives of people in a way that gives us this sense of hope for the future. So the center essentially, I think, begins with this positive affirmation of pluralism. But it also, I think, points out that pluralism is a complicated idea and not something that's a kind of inborn trait within us. It's something that we need to cultivate. It's almost the way I think of a garden. You can have flowers reflecting the diversity of fauna in the world in an environment which is wild. But when you take those flowers and that fauna and put it in a garden and reimagine the way in which they interact with each other, you create a garden. It's a human construction. And the flowers by themselves may reflect diversity, but the flowers together constituting a garden represent pluralism. So I think one of the ways in which the center tries to do this is to create a framework for educational programs, which would then be disseminated, I think, into schools with partners at universities, but also within the communities that live across the world. The second is to give an award to exemplary ways in which pluralism is being practiced at the political level, at the social level, at the human level. So if you look at some of the awards that were given during the last cycle, there was one given to a woman in Cameroon who is an indefatigable sort of fighter for human rights within the Cameroon. And she has enabled communities to come together, to start conversations, to build relationships across villages. It was interesting now in retrospect that one of the awardees was from Palestine. And this was to create internal conversations within not only the Palestinian community, but the Israeli community on ways in which they might be able to coexist. And that kind of seems like a dim sort of part of what's happening today. It seems to be dwindling, but that potential was recognized in that way. And then there's an exemplary project in Mexico, which again looks at the human rights situation, particularly as it affects women in South America, and then tries to create opportunities for these to be corrected. So if you look at these awards, they are meant to be based in communities, but they exemplify traits that could be practiced globally. There's also a globalism index or monitor, which you can use in various parts of the world to measure the levels at which pluralism is thriving or not thriving. And this enables you to look at individual countries or individual societies and see what points of correction might be necessary. And I think one example of a recent publication is the effort to get people to think more seriously about constitutionalism. The idea that if you build safeguards into the foundational principles on which a country bases its activities, then you might make headway towards creating a more pluralistic society. So I think these are some of the ways in which the center tries to spread its message, but it's early now in its days. And when it started, there was a lot of optimism that, you know, while pluralism was generally accepted in most societies, it would perhaps require greater effort to embed it in kind of institutional mechanisms where it could find a life of its own and grow. But there are now all these headwinds that I think pluralism, the success of pluralism faces. A lot of it is generated, I think, by what Malise spoke about the rise of new social media, which has a tremendous amount of potential, but a tremendous amount of potential for harm as well. And I think what we are seeing in the world today is this kind of villagization. Malise referred to it as compartmentalization. And that's what's happening. The notion of the other is that the other is in a compartment, and it is safer for us to remain in our own compartment and not create too much interaction, because that might be dangerous for our sense of self-preservation and identity. And I think this kind of, well, in the old days, we used to call it jingoism, I think is now prevalent across most societies and promoted by political leaders and by media, which uses various means to increase polarization. So I don't need to catalog these headwinds, because I think we can read about them in the news even today as things are unfolding. But the center is a place for hope. It's a place that takes an optimistic view of the world, and it believes ultimately that human beings are able to make an effort to create for themselves better interactions across societies, but also between individuals. And I think in this kind of transnational world that we live in, where there is also so much misunderstanding and fear about the other, that's probably the avenue to start building a degree of trust and to deepen that trust in societies so that they will not fracture.
Thank you, Azim, for that wonderful background you've given us and even left us on a moment of hope. I think that this is a fascinating conversation, but we have just that 1 hour to work with. So I'm going to now ask Dr. Kassim-Lakha to give us a very succinct synthesis with the 3 big takeaways. Salim, I think your job is not easy. This has been an extremely rich discourse, but could you give us just your idea in a succinct synthesis of what are your takeaways before I come back and thank everybody for a very rich discourse.
Thank you, Mohamed, and thank you very much, Azim and Malise. You have provided us with fascinating insights. There's lots to think about. And I think, as Mohamed said, it is a challenging task to sum up what are huge ideas and important concepts like pluralism, for example. Now, what struck me in the presentations or discussions, I should say, with Azim and Malise was a sense of hope that was conveyed. And I think in these challenging times, that sense of hope is extremely important. Azim's initial focus on the madrasas and the education that was provided through the madrasas, what it communicated to me was the importance of delivering education and delivering other services through community-based organizations, in this case, madrasas, as he mentioned, places of trust or spaces of trust. And what is significant in all the areas that Azim and Malise have talked about is success, effectiveness of projects, ideas is based if it is community-oriented, it is culturally relevant, and it is culturally meaningful to the communities that are affected by these projects, programs, and so on and so forth. Now, the madrasas, I think, bring that out very clearly. And what Azim has provided us is an idea, an understanding of how the madrasas work in East Africa, which is in contrast to popular understandings of madrasas in many Western societies. They are often run down as places that don't provide proper education and so on. So I think the community-based approach, which uses spaces of trust, is a very innovative way of delivering education. And I think in places where you have school dropouts, not sufficient school attendance, these occur where you have education that is not culturally relevant. And that cultural relevance, community-based approach is something that also comes through when Azim spoke about the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Now, the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, listening to Azim, communicated to me that it was really fulfilling multiple aspirations. On the one hand, the example of the Bangladesh mosque was a space where people could satisfy their spiritual yearnings. The bridge in Tehran connected communities, and I'm sure these connections are social as well as economic. And similarly, the other examples that Azim provided of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture fulfill aspirations of local communities because they are culturally meaningful to them and they are culturally relevant. And I think this is something which is lost sometimes in the architectural profession or the profession of architecture. I can go on about that for a while, but we are really limited by time. Let me also say that, Malise, in his presentation, raised issues of education which were on a much larger scale, you might say. And what I was really struck by Malise's presentation was his reference to Ibn Khaldun. Now, I ask myself, how many sociology departments in the Western world use Ibn Khaldun as an example of early sociological work? And I think this really points to a gap about education on Islam, on Islamic civilization. And I think Malise's presentation provided us with some hope when he spoke about the way in which internet cyber technology can become more kind of relevant. It can allow people to engage in discourses that are alternative to the ones produced by the state. In other words, it allows people to examine ideas emanating from different sources, and it also allows them to go back to some of the philosophers in Islam, like Avicenna that Malise mentioned, and appreciate their works. And I think this is one of the great problems that the Muslim world faces today, is that the education is through the Western prism. We know about Durkheim, we know about Marx, Max Weber, but very few of us can talk about some of the Islamic, or I should say Muslim philosophers and their ideas, and how their ideas might in some cases converge with those of Western philosophy and Western philosophers. So I think the presentations which, or the discussion, I should say, which Malise and Azim engaged with Mohamed give us a lot to think about and lot to work on. And I think the Global Center for Pluralism, I have great regard for that center because I think it is doing something which is going beyond superficial understandings of multiculturalism. As one of the critiques of multiculturalism said, it is not just about samosas, sambal, and samba. You know, we really need to understand how we can generate greater empathy with our neighbors, with our colleagues, with people from other communities, how we can understand each other. And I think what Malise said to say about pluralism being a complicated idea, I think that is something that needs to be taken on board. Otherwise, you know, one is likely to face many disappointments. It is something to be cultivated, as Azim put it. And here I'm reminded of what His Highness, the Aga Khan, mentioned, that pluralism is not a product, it is a process. And being a process, it's going to be challenging. And it will not necessarily progress in a linear fashion. So I have to say that, you know, we need to take these messages on board. Both Malise and Azim have communicated very important ideas, and ideas that I think have a lot of merit, which need to be taken up in education institutions, which need to be addressed in education institutions in a serious way. And I think that is where our hope lies. Education, not only through schools, secondary schools, as Malise mentioned, education at university level, but I think education also at the level of the media. And as Malise pointed out, that what media is looking for is bad news and not good news. So I think I'll stop at that. And I would like to thank Mohamed for giving me an opportunity to sum up. And I hope I've done justice to what Azim and Malise have communicated to us. So back to you, Mohamed.
Thank you so much, Salim, for the difficult task of putting together in a nutshell, which was such a rich and, you know, multi-layered discourse. All it remains for me to do now is to just say thank you to everybody. Firstly, to Abdullah for organizing this program so beautifully and making it possible for the Institute of Ismaili Studies and your organization at Melbourne to be able to conduct these discourses on contemporary Muslim thought. I'd like to say special thanks to Azim and Malise for your wonderful presentation in the discourse, and to Salim for bringing in that lovely summary which has enriched our discourse. With those words, I'd like to say thank you to everybody. I owe a great gratitude to the staff here at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, particularly Rihanna and Aqil, who've put in a lot of effort in ensuring that the program today could take place. I want to thank the director, Professor Salim Kassim, the head of the communications department, Dr. Shiraz Kabani, and all those people who've made it possible for this program to take place. With those words, I'd like to say thank you once again. Good day to all of you, and wonderful to what bringing on the table such rich experiences that could help us go forward in these discussions. Thank you so much.